Yeah, I think we might be. I'm not sure if Karthik is here. Let me check to make sure.
Okay, may I check whether everyone is here? Is everyone from China is here? Yeah. Is everyone from Japan is here?
Yes, we're all here.
Okay, and all the judges.
I know we're definitely missing one judge. Oh, Karthik's on now. Okay, cool.
So, all are here. Okay. So welcome to the preliminary round 6, the online. Are we all good? Okay. So welcome to the preliminary round 6 of the online WSDC tournament 2020. We would like to introduce the Team Japan who are on proposition and Team China who are on opposition. I'm Jason and I'll be your chairperson.
I am also Jason and I'll be your timekeeper for this round.
And now let us welcome our esteemed panel of judges.
May we have the judges to introduce themselves?
Sure. Hi, I'm Venus. I'm from Malaysia. I'll be your judge for today.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm from Singapore and I'm one of the panelists for today.
One more. So all the judges are here, right? Okay.
Karthik's account is here, but his video just went off. Let me try and see if I can contact him.
Shall we wait?
My internet's a little bit spotty right now. Let me fix that.
Okay, while waiting, may I have the proposition to introduce themselves in the order in which they will be speaking? It's also serve as a technical check. May I have Team Japan to introduce themselves in the order in which you'll be speaking in?
Hello, I'm Senator Kim. I'm going to be the Prime Minister for this round. Hi, I'm Kotaro Yoshida. I'll be the second proposition speaker on proposition reply.
Is this on? Hi, I'm Kana Kanzaki, and I'll be the whip speaker from Proposition today.
Okay, thank you. May we now have the opposition to introduce themselves?
Hi, my name's Sam, and I'll be the leader of opposition today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lin, and I'll be the second and reply speaker for side opposition. Hi, everyone. My name is Shuray Lai, and I will be third opposition for Team China.
Okay, thank you. May I ask both teams to put their lineups in the chat, including the reply speaker?
Right, Karthik's.
Before we begin,
Sorry.
Is it okay if I share my screen to show the timing for debate this round?
Yeah, and also Karthik's just let me know that he is trying to connect to Zoom from his phone. So we might have to wait a short while for that. While we're doing that, does either team have a preference for verbal versus non-verbal POIs?
For me, I don't mind any kind of POI. If it's verbal or if it's video, I'll take either.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, we don't mind. I don't mind any kind of POI. If it's verbal, I'll take it. If it's by video, I'll probably see it either way. So whichever.
Same with Team China, but we probably just prefer verbal POIs throughout the whole round in one format, so we are not looking for two things. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
I think my internet's much better now.
Okay, while waiting for one of the judges, I want to say observers, coaches, and team managers are reminded to keep their microphones and videos off at all times during this debate round.
Yeah, I think Karthik's back, so we should be all good.
So may I check if? Okay, so may we begin now?
Yep.
Okay, so may we now have the first speaker from the proposition to begin the debate. Anytime you're ready.
Thank you. In 2014, KKK leader created the first hate site, Stormport. This website was specifically created in order to promote neo-Nazi ideas about white supremacy that decided to oppress African Americans and support anti-Jewish kinds of messages. What occurred in real life was a consequence where African Americans was led into a world of plunder, where they couldn't gain the same basic rights as white people, and we think that the power of words which relates to actions is something incomparable. On our side, we promote a world where no one has to live in fear of being prosecuted on a daily basis, fear of being discriminated. We want to give protection to those who deserve protection the most. I'm extremely happy to propose. Our model is 4 points. Firstly, by offensive contents, we will say that these are contents that directly target certain groups and specifically tries to oppress them. This is going to look like labels like homosexuality is a disease. It looks like the spreading of neo-Nazi ideas. We think this inherently is something that rips apart. We're going to have search engines use computers and administrations to look through context and make sure that you restrict tweets or posts. Thirdly, by engines, which specifically means by Google or Twitter, when most sites currently already do restrict hate speech, we think it is in the cases where this restriction is insufficient, we're happy to have individuals keep on reporting posts in case it doesn't fit them. Realize that this is something not new, but is an extension of the status quo.
Clarification.
If you do have objections, we think you can file for questions from the administration. We think that's simple. I'll take your clarification.
So do you find that the police could seem offensive to policemen? So clarify on your side who defines what is offensive.
Sure. I think firstly, it's normally going to be the search engine in and of itself. While that may be subjective, we think it's just better than any kind of unrestricted speech. If you want clarifications, I'll talk about them later. We think their burden is pretty simple. We think that if you're able to prove that these search engines have a moral obligation to do so, or we are able to explain why we're able to significantly make people's lives better, we think we should win this debate. Opposition needs to defend both these burdens. I'm happy to propose. I'm going to forward you two constructive speech arguments. Firstly, why search engines have a moral obligation to do so. Secondly, why we're able to protect minority groups. Firstly, why media search engines have a moral obligation. Notice that fundamentally, freedom of speech is not an absolute concept. This is because democracy is a concept and a balance of rights, right? For instance, we ban things in the public sphere like hate speech, like nudity, because people have a right to be protected from abhorrent things. Notice that these rights to be protected is prioritized comparison to the right to offend, because these values is simply just better, and you benefit both parties at the moment in which you prioritize the right to not be offended. Given this, why do we think that mainstream engines are equivalent to the public sphere? Firstly, because of the sheer number of users. People from various identities around various backgrounds, various countries opt into these mainstream engines like Google. They come here in order to access information, seeking the truth about certain pieces of information. But secondly, given that in the 21st century, people are in a state of coexistence with these states, these states are in sufficiently the online public spheres for people. Notice that opposition might come up here and say that people can just not go to these websites if they don't want to be exposed. But in the 21st century, people have to be able to access these search engines to do anything in this world. And this is important because it's simply impossible for us to opt out of these spheres. Therefore, at the point in which mainstream engines are approximately societal, there's a need for us to restrict it. We think this is a natural extension of the restrictions we impose. Given that there is a need to restrict sexist and offensive words, why should it be specifically the search engines that do this? First, it's because of capacity. That is, it is the search engines that knows all the data. It knows all the users, what appears. Notice that this means that they have the moral responsibility to ensure that the environment they provide is clean and not offensive. And that's why we can't have other kind of external variables involved in this. But secondly, it's in terms of profit and moral responsibility, right? The way engines are able to make profit is through the gaining of user data or any kind of user information. So we would argue on a proposition that it is morally irresponsible for engines to gain profit off like any kind of incentives of people to just try to plunder people into a state of disinformation. We think inherently these engines have a responsibility to not make profit off interests of racist people. Therefore, we say not only is it legitimate in restricting freedom of speech, we think it should always be the engines that do this because they are the ones that are responsible for maintaining the environment. Let's move on to my second argument about why we better protect minority groups. Firstly, let me contextualize what these sexist and offensive contents look like. The thing to note here crucially is that it is usually constructed by the denial of unchangeable factors of people's identities. For example, it looks like words like all Muslims are terrorists, or African Americans should be slaves, or the white people are the superior race. Secondly, is that in terms of echo chambers effects. When people visualize these racist views or they see any kind of similar usually are pushed into a cycle where you always see similar racist or sexist posts. No, thank you. These things are exacerbated in the status quo because people start to think this is even true, and this usually shifts to more radical terrorism or radical sexism. The third thing to notice is that in the status quo, these kind of offensive words are pushed into a subconscious effect. That is, that when you're daily exposed to kind of racist and sexist values, there's a subtle efficiency where you start to subtly think that racism and sexism is a norm in society. We think that these three things are something that characterizes the status quo. Given that the status quo is extremely...
Point of information.
So thank you. We think as a result, these offensive contents contextualize it into real-life consequences. Before I explain the impact, sure.
Arrest of a worker promoting protectionist policies and kicking out immigrants will be offensive to Asians, versus they would say, like, not letting me have this speech on itself is offensive to me as well. So when it comes to balancing two contradictory opinions that are both offensive, which one will you prioritize?
Sorry, that was kind of too long. So if you're trying to say which side deserves rights, we're just going to prioritize one. The rights to not be offended. If you want to criticize something, that should be based on constructive criticism, not on illogical, radical, sexist ideas. Given that, let's move on back to my impacts. What happens in the status quo and how are we able to prevent this? Firstly, is that on their side, these kind of offensive words means that people can group up and shift the norm to the public sphere in believing that these racist views are good. For instance, this looks like the plunder of refugees of Kurdians in Turkey or the Tamil in Sri Lanka, because hate speech online is what directly led to refugees being kicked up and spat out because everyone online thought that was the correct thing to do. But secondly, is that for minorities, this usually means a huge amount of mental damage. And notice this isn't something that is small, right? For instance, you normally have normal Muslim or celebrities usually exposed to online bashing for their whole existence. the fact that the consequence is that in countries like Japan, you have celebrities literally killing themselves in the status quo because they're denied of the fundamental right from being protected. Third impact is that on their side, you usually create discrimination, right? That is, you now have people that are not going to be discriminated. You're going to have people that are discriminated in the interview. We think people should refuse of getting jobs. We think that's internally culpable. And fourthly, is that now you're going to have moms, innocent moms, going on search engines like Google, and these kind of moms are usually going to search up like homosexuality is a sin. We think at that point that is something negative and something that we ought to pursue. My second speaker is going to elaborate. I'm so happy to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
Thank you for the speech.
Can I begin? Am I audible?
You may begin.
Yeah, cool. All right. Censoring offensive content frames progressive movements as the aggressors of the establishment rather than the pioneers of change. Side opposition opposes that. In terms of burdens, I just want to make something very clear. Proposition failed on their own metric. They wanted to say that the justification for this was harm to people, but both sides in a racist discussion can be harmed. We gave you the example of Rust Belt workers who could be harmed by offensive messages and who themselves could deliver offensive messages regarding the situation of Chinese workers stealing their own money. Importantly, their stance was not about harm. It was that we should oppose messages considered offensive by the progressive political establishment at the cost of individuals whose views we would say are equally as legitimate. But notice, I would say that they have to provide an additional burden as to why it is justified for these unsanctioned, unelected individuals existing and running these search engines to be able to take a stance on politics, something they were unable to do from first. 3 points of setup from opposition. Number one, we believe mainstream search engines should list results with sexist, racist, and offensive content. 2, we would still prosecute and oppose content that insinuates actual assault and potential violent hate crimes as is done already in the status quo. So an example of the distinction between our side and theirs is we would still display an article saying Trump calls Mexican racist, but we would not list a form of a potential public shooter openly talking about his plans to bomb a mosque. The distinction may be difficult, and when it is ambiguous, we will err on the side of showing content. With that, there are 2 arguments I want to bring in this speech. Number one, why it's unjust for them to do this, and second of all, why it's counterproductive to the very goals they want to address. But before that, I just want to make a quick rebuttal in terms of their own principle. They said that democracy entails a balance of rights, so we should protect minorities and those who are offended. Number one, it's their burden to prove why they will pragmatically be offended on their side, so long as I'm able to prove that it is counterproductive, their principle doesn't stand. But second of all, there was no explanation as to why they would legitimately hurt, besides this idea of how, you might normalize this idea when you see all of this. I would say they are unlikely to be hurt even if you show this content. Why? Because they have dozens of outlets by which they are able to express their concerns regarding racist speech. For example, minorities can always turn to the democratic establishment Singapore for the support and for the support that minorities want, because they will always have a party that caters to their needs. But second of all, because there are social movements like the feminist movement and Black Lives Matter that are able to campaign for those ideals. But you know who I think doesn't have those outlets to express those concerns? The very poor Rust Belt worker that Jacqueline told you about in her point of information, who is vulnerable, who has lost their job as a result of Chinese workers and Chinese trade deals, but is unable to express those concerns because now you censor all the content they want to address. So if harm is the mechanism, they need to prove why it's mutually exclusive to the particular individuals they want to care about, and why we should not prioritize the people we so care about. First argument, why is it unjust? The argument here is that search engines should not have the mandate to control political thought. And I'm going to explain this argument in 2 parts. Number one, about the role of speech and what speech counts as offensive. Because I would say that all speech is offensive to particular and different groups of people in a way that is mutually exclusive. What counts as offensive is a subjective metric. It's almost entirely based on the experience and past history of individuals. For example, a happy depiction of families on vacation could be seen as offensive to someone under economic strain. fame, as seen as a promotion of wealth disparity. The point to be made here is that when offense is a subjective metric for silencing individuals, we should not apply this subjective metric to all kinds of results, arbitrarily eliminating some results simply on the basis of what a couple people within a particular company want. Because what is offensive is subjective and it's not black and white. Political biases that you have. No, thank you. But second of all, even if offense is the metric, search engines cannot be the decision maker on politics because they have no mandate to make statements regarding politics. When you adjudicate the impact of offensive statements, it means that you prioritize certain groups over others at the cost of groups of people who could be equally vulnerable. For example, blocking the Black Lives Matter post, no thank you, makes statements that cops, makes it seem that statements of cops are less important than that of protesters. A restaurant worker who's trying to lift themselves up by their split straps versus immigrants who are actually taking their jobs. These are all genuine concerns, and you should not arbitrarily weigh one over the other. The conclusion of this argument, therefore, is that we should support representation on all sides. That you do have a mandate as a search engine to deliver information in a way that is impartial, and that when you interfere within politics, you adjudicate what is right and wrong in a way that is unfortunately morally unacceptable. Second, why is it counterproductive to addressing racism? No, thank you. I'm going to divide this argument into analyzing three stakeholders. Number one, how do racists respond? Two, centrists and how they react. And three, on progressives and how we actually solve the problem of racism and the kinds of issues of offensive content they want to talk. First then, how exactly do racist people respond? I would say that what you do is cancel out the legitimate concerns that many of these individuals have in a way that aggravates them. Why do people have offensive views? The reason is because of past experiences that translate to current views. No one is born a racist. I would name 4 examples to illustrate this. Number one, bullies are more likely to come from broken households in which they had abusive parents. 2, sexists may have had bad experiences with women, which they apply to a macro level. 3, racists may have been told by parents not to play with other races, which further leads to bias. And 4, there are always economic implications. We gave you the example of what happens if you hate the Chinese because COVID-19 took away someone's life and you didn't have the information or education to do that. The point to be made here is that there is always a story, that every perpetrator of offensive content was originally a victim who has a story to tell and who deserves our engagement. Why then do they make the problem worse? When you no longer list their concerns, you decrease engagement with individuals who hold offensive views. You no longer comment on their websites. You no longer talk to them using their website information. Those are the links that their impacts implicitly rely on. This has 5 impacts. Number 1, you are no longer able to address the nuances and reasons behind their offensive views. It's more difficult to generate political capital towards fighting for Rust Belt workers when their campaigns are constantly censored as bigoted. This means that their views are reinforced because you never address the root reasons why people are racist in the first place. But 2, there is less ability to engage. If all the subreddits on Reddit that are racist are no longer shown on Google, it is more difficult for me as a liberal person to engage with these views in a way that promotes constructive engagement. But 3, you anger these people. It is a natural human defense mechanism to fight back when you feel wrong. When you constantly censor their views, that is the point at which they retaliate against the social establishment that refuses to listen to them. It's the point at which you physically lash out at the liberals around you, at the Chinese computer scientist from Yahoo who lives down the street. We saw this when Ben Shapiro's speech was canceled at universities, leading to him feeling wrong and his own supporters backlashing toward the liberal establishment within those very same schools that they wanted to protect. But you also minimize the problem. When I go on Google and Google racism and nothing comes up, the reaction I have towards things like the Black Lives Matter movement is that they are overreacting, meaning it's far harder to generate social support towards addressing these concerns. Second of all, how do centrists respond? I would say that centrists are far less likely to support anti-racism and anti-oppressive efforts on their side of the house. Why? Because the liberal establishment loses their comparative advantage as always being framed as the campaign of change. I would say that historically, Democrats and liberal individuals have always tried to use reason as a justification for why they do things, as opposed to racists and sexists who focus on tradition and emotion. But when you are seen as the individuals who are now taking away the opportunities to others to speak out, that is the point at which you're no longer seen as the side of rationality. It is the point at which those individuals who are deciding between whether or not to follow the progressive establishment and their side of the house end up deciding towards the racists because they do not see why this movement is somehow beneficial. This means, therefore, that victims are far more benefited on our side when you opt towards things like constructive engagement, when you learn why they are racist and act towards policy changes that aim to take the emotion out of the issue and solve it. There's more sympathy on our side towards things like the Black Lives Matter movement, meaning that we are able to cater towards the individuals that they want to help the most. So because it is principally unjustified to do this, and because it is counterproductive, I'm so proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 21 seconds.
Thank you for your speech. May we now have the second speaker from the proposition. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Am I audible? It was extremely offensive for the side opposition to come up here and claim that Rust Belt workers need to use offensive language in order to express their own identities. We think that they are educated to the extent that they can make a rational discourse and they can simply say that immigration needs to be stopped. You don't need to use an expressive and visual language, an offensive language, in order for you to express your own identity. We think that was absolutely absurd. And my argument in this debate would be how we provide places for safe discourse on our side of the house. But before moving on, two questions that I'm going to ask. Firstly, is it principally just? Secondly, the impact to the society as a whole. Firstly, to the principle, right? Is it just? The only practical response that we got from the first opposition, was the idea that, Rust Belt workers are going to be harmed on our side of the house, and they are vulnerable actors too. Firstly, I want to ask to what extent and to how many people actually wants to express and have the desire to use an offensive and expressive language in order to demean minority communities, because we think that what they are on our side of the house, many people are going to stop doing this stuff because this is a secondary right inherently, and this is not important to people because people want to prioritize the convenience of using social media, for instance, or using Google over that very gay right that they have talked about. Right. But also, again, this is offensive to say that they're uneducated. But finally, the comparison here is that this is a secondary right inherently, right? But what they are sacrificing, and the trade-off that they have to make in this debate, would be the right for minority to not be demeaned their own identity, to be able to express and freely their own identity, which is far more important in terms of balance of rights. We outweigh their harms, right? Then furthermore, I just want to note that the second speech about how this is counterproductive is not a direct opposition to the principal claim that we are making. Because, for instance, we do not regulate, we do not simply legalize public nudity just because, for instance, in the long term, there will be discourse around public nudity and it's going to be beneficial on that side of the house. That's not going to actually mean that you can actually legalize public nudity on the public sphere. The reason is very simple. You need to take a consideration about the short-term outcome rather than the long-term outcome which debaters want to talk about. That is a really, so that means that it's not necessarily contingent upon the practical arguments. Now, then they say, the offense is really subjective, but their model suggested that they are going to err on the side of free speech at the point where it's arbitrary. That means that on our side of the house, we can err on the side of caution. We can say that when minorities are likely to, it's arbitrary, but when minorities are likely to be offended, we can always err on the side of the vulnerable when powers of force, right? That means it's peaceful. Now, they say their main contention, principal contention was that, was that search engines should not be the decision-making actor in this debate. Firstly, I want to note that the society check and balance system exists. For instance, when you look at the current Facebook controversy regarding the Facebook ads usage, for instance, we think that the society has the right and has the influence to push back against this social media at the point where they abuse the system. We think that works. But secondly, we talked about the moral obligation specifically because those search engines and good companies like Google profits off of their platforms. They have a reciprocal responsibility to actually control this. Right, point of information.
Point. So if families who have been robbed of food stamps call Margaret Thatcher a witch, and Margaret Thatcher thinks that's sexist, would you take off that complaint from that starving family?
Yes, we would take that away. Because we would always err on the side of caution, and that is very important. Okay. So secondly, let's talk about the impact to the society. Their main point was how this is counterproductive, right? The first thing they say is that it's a legitimate, the first thing that they say is that, that it's a legitimate concern, that hate speech is a legitimate concern because it's based on past experiences. But following their logic, even rapists and murderers can be justified on that side because it's genetic, disorder, for instance, or because it's their past experiences that ultimately make them to kill other people. That is just unacceptable. But secondly, what we are saying is very simple. Because at the point where you don't no longer see any form of racist website, we are going to change the experiences of those people. Because Google has a lot of power, Google is very convenient. People are going to still continue to use Google on our side of us. What happens is that people are not going to, have the experience of being surrounded by the racist rhetoric on our side of the house. That means we can effectively change the behavior. The second thing that they talk about is how those people are likely to be radicalized. But firstly, again, to what extent is right to offend important? Because we can always claim that the immigration is something wrong, or something that we are going to oppose. We don't see that, right? So people are likely to prioritize their own convenience over to display rights. Then they say, centrist voters are likely to be swayed to the side of racism. But here's the thing: those centrist voters are not going to see racist rhetoric on social media, are not going to see racist rhetoric on Google. What that means here is the amount of information they're likely to see is much more likely to be in favor of the progressive ideologies. That means that the centrist voters are likely to turn to inclusivity to minority. That's why it's practically beneficial on our side of the house. I just want to also point out the lack of responsiveness on that side of the house. They've been very engaged. But moving on to the final argument about how we provide places for safe discourse. So in the status quo, unfortunately, many young people use offensive languages like swear words, like F words and S words on social media. But on our side of the house, we nudge people to behave well online. Two things. Firstly, languages that people use are constructed through the environment. A good example would be the equity violation in debating tournaments. When people are told that you should not use offensive language, people are going to be careful about the offensive about the use of language, right? And when all the sites you see do not use offensive languages, people are likely to behave in similar manners. The second mechanism is that you genuinely don't want your Facebook post to be taken down, to be taken down. So there's an incentive to be careful about your own language. This actually, I want to know, this actually not only changes people's behavior online, but also is effective at changing the behavior offline. Because young people spend a lot of time on using smartphones, going on Instagram, for instance. But furthermore, as Senna correctly pointed out, misinformation is likely to be eradicated on our side of the house. That means the information that people get would also be good. There are three impacts that I'm having. Firstly, minorities are politically alienating the status quo because oftentimes it involves discriminatory languages and insults. But now they can, for the first time, join in proper political discourse among the majority because people are not going to use extremely offensive languages. Secondly, negative campaigning is likely to decrease on our side of the house, but rather the politics is going to be focused, more on actual policy outcomes because of the simple fact that people are not going to get used to these offensive languages. Thirdly, given that people are forced to be careful about their languages, many people can now extend their moral character to other people, including these from other demographics, other than the demographics from which they are. For all these reasons, we create a safer society and protect minority crowds we propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
Thank you for your speech. May we now have the second speaker from the opposition to begin? So you may begin whenever you're ready.
Hang on 1 second, please. Just grabbing some paper. Sorry. Just because people don't say it doesn't mean the undercurrents of racism roaming in your heart will change. So it means from a third-party perspective, I can look into a Christian school and think that everything is well and good because the internet is my sole way to look into what's happening there. But in reality, the same racist targeting, bullying will exist in that school. The same name-calling will exist. All the actualized physical crimes will still happen because of racist incentives. The only thing that changes is no one else will know because this information is robbed off of social media. What they want to defend is a world in which we look at social media and feel content because there's this perception of justice and fairness when in reality, the most heinous crimes will continue to foster in the worst way, but just out of our eyesight. That's not true justice, which is why we're proud to oppose. A few clarifications before three broader questions. First, we don't think they can say Twitter is a search engine because the search function in an app doesn't make it a search engine. Just like how I can press search of all the songs and all of the tweets that exist in Twitter or Spotify doesn't mean that they're serving the same function as Google. A search engine is a bridge, a connector to tie you into information, not a pipe, not someone who publishes and uploads information. That is the difference. But two, we also stand against hate crimes and violent acts. So their examples are like the KKK, terrorist organizations that target a specific identity. That's something we can prevent as well because it's already illegal to incite violence with your speech. This is about the more gray area cases where it's debatable if something is offensive. It's more subjective metric. There's no such thing as there's absolute harm. And there's
Point of information.
That she said and all of these things. 3 questions in his speech. First,
Before that,
no thank you. My substantive material on why you hurt victims on their side. Secondly, a principal engagement on the duty of search engines. And lastly, why we combat racism in the social level. But firstly, I want to prevent my substantive because it perfectly clashes with what they're saying. So let's look at how their side will look like. They think that after they censor this type of racist will still catcall because I think it's okay. I will still touch my female coworkers because I have sexist tendencies to objectify them. The same racist hirer will still not give opportunities to Black applicants who submit their portfolio. So even if the speech is taken off of the internet, the same biases exist. So let's look at how in the status quo, victims of such discrimination use use search engines in their favor. One, they can research employment opportunities. They can search up their boss, search the companies to see what the culture is like, see if in any interview there was a slip of tongue and they said something offensive about women, they said something offensive about immigrants coming into the country, and therefore protect themselves ahead of time or don't submit themselves to such situations because they can inform themselves with search engines. The second way to use it is to arm themselves with information on politics. Yeah, I as a Catholic woman might have been intending to vote for Trump because I believe in certain socially conservative views. But when I hear that he called women, that we should grab these people by their private parts, that might change my mind. Yes, that's an offensive quote that Trump has said, and therefore will be censored on their side because it's triggering. But it might change just how one woman votes to protect her own interests and to help politics skew in her favor. This is information that people in politics deserve to know, and they drop away because of the offensiveness. But 3, complaint filing. Because most of the times when you want to start an actual investigation, you need to prove the likelihood that this person actually acts in character and is offensive to these people. And that's why you need some evidence, like old profiles of them doing blackface. So you certainly have more credibility that this person might have been having racist tendencies in the office and file an actual complaint on their biases in the admissions process. None of these things will be accessible to victims if you just take them off of Google, take them out of Twitter's search engine. All these things will be inaccessible and therefore complaint filing won't happen. So what's the weighing of this argumentation? At their best, people go on social media and feel happier because they don't even actually realize that there's so much racism in the world and there's so much toxicity on social media. But the undercurrents of racism, the way that it actualizes in physical harm will continue to happen, but victims are deprived of certain information for them to self-guard and self-arm to protect against such racist actions. And that's why they hurt victims, because the physical harm is our priority over creating this perception of utopia on social media. But secondly, I want to engage your principle on the duty of a search engine. So they need to prove 2 things for this argument to stand. 1, that offensiveness is the line to draw to hinder free speech, and 2, social engine should be the actor. Let's rebut each. Offensive should not be the line, because if offense is wrong because it hurts another third party, they hurt more people as well. In the POI, we asked that a family who has been taken off of food stamps can call Margaret Thatcher a witch, and they said no, which shows how this family can no longer voice out their anger and dissatisfaction with the political establishment when literally their livelihoods have been robbed away from them. That lack of accountability mechanism on their side is harm the third party as well. But more importantly, this is not just about, can I complain about Margaret Thatcher in another language like they would say, but it's about 2 things. 1, I cannot viscerally exhibit how I feel as a person who has been taking off the living necessities, and 2, how this open-ended definition of offensiveness makes us prone to politicization, that it's more identity politics that stops any dissenters from rising up, that if someone wants to criticize Obama's policies,
Point of information.
that's a racist tendency that you criticize me, or for the fact that there's an article published against J.F. Kennedy during his time, he can say, well, he mentioned something about my Catholic descent and therefore I want to remove it. The
Point of information.
of this type of offensiveness makes it a wrong line to draw when it can be abused, especially by the majority, because they're the ones who can file the most complaints, they can garner attention, and therefore offensiveness will be defined by them. But 2, we told you right, all offensive, right? Some of the things are not even meant to be an attacking thing, like just posting vacation photos. It can still be taken as offensive. That is not fair punishment. They haven't engaged with that case. I'll take a POI now.
If you oppose subjective metrics for the reason of restriction, do you oppose the equity policy in this tournament?
Wait, I'm really confused, because if the equity is on, no one should be attacking me, no one should be threatening me with sexual assault because I'm a woman in the private chat, that's a very good equity policy. But if it's about expressing your political views and I see it as offensive because I'm an Asian woman and I don't like the quarantine orders in Chinatown, that's not right? And also, my personal opinion has nothing to do with this. Please keep this within the debate. But secondly, they need to prove why social engine should be the actor. The 2 reasons they give us are both false. The first is saying they have the capacity because they know all data, but Google is just a redirector. They redirect you to a link. The actual post is made by Facebook. The data is there. So Google has no control over who the users are or what the data entails. And the second thing they told you is, will you profit on user information? No, Google makes revenue on the ads they run on the page, not based on the information. Because the terms and contracts exactly say Facebook shouldn't be leaking the individual user data, and therefore there's no way Google is actually benefiting off of the user data when the actual speech is not being published on Google. They only track the searcher, but that's not a reason to threaten whatever the speaker is trying to say. But lastly, I want to talk about combating racism, because they never prove on their side why the censorship will change racist beliefs and therefore racist acts will continue. So when they don't talk and actively express their racist views, that's the only difference and delta in this debate, then why is it even worse on their side? 1, because these people go to echo chambers to talk, like Reddit, like anonymous websites away from search engines with only people that agree with them, and that furthers racist views and confirms that they're correct, furthering racist tendencies and justifying racist actions and crimes in real life. 2, because the anger of being silenced will mean they turn to more extreme mechanisms to gain attention. You don't want to listen to me, and that's why I get angry and try to go for more extreme ways to get that attention. That looks like the white supremacist marches you see in Kansas. It was started because the alt-right leader was taken off of Twitter and censored, therefore he turned resort to burning people and burning things and burning parts to garner that attention. And all these things are even more harmful to minorities when it goes into the physical world for attention. But two, they get less support for minority movements because the people who are actually searching things up are those people who don't have a prior understanding of the movement. So they're thinking about what Pride is about, what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. And when they go on social media and there's no offensive statement about racism, about Black people, there's no offensive statement about like people who are transgender, calling them sissy and things like that. That's when they don't understand why you have the Black Lives Matter. They don't understand the urgency behind these movements, and therefore they're not galvanized. So for you, they create a fake utopia. We want true justice. We're so proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you for your speech. May we now have the third speaker from the proposition. You may begin whenever you are ready.
Hi, am I audible? Okay. We think it is very problematic that opposition talked about a very small context in this debate today. They talked about people losing their jobs and being angry or political differences, but rather the majority of the issue in the status quo is minorities being told to go kill themselves and go to hell. This is the case that opposition needs to engage about because this is the biggest issue in the status quo. Two things I'll be doing in my speech. Firstly, whether moral obligation or freedom of speech should be prioritized, and secondly, about the point of discourse. So on the first, so what did opposition tell us? Opposition told us that within our case, there's a very unclear line and people would get shut out when the topic is extremely controversial. Three things to say. Firstly, as our DPM already told you, we think that the issue in the status quo is the bad language, the profanity that exists. And it's rather offensive for opposition to think that people can't speak without using swear words. We think it is possible to state your opinion. You don't have to say F Trump. You can say, I personally do not like Trump. We think that's something that can easily be changed and can still maintain this freedom of speech. Secondly, about where we draw the line. We've told you from our model that if the line is unclear, we're happy to take it to court and for courts to decide if the article is legitimate or not. We think this is rather better than what opposition gives us, right? Opposition gives us a world of discourse. Discourse done by the majority through profanity, and we do not support this, and we think that courts are rather a better place to discuss what is good or not. Thirdly, even if we restrict everything, we think it is extremely, if something is extremely offensive to one individual, we should take it down. We're happy to take the trade-off to protect the Chinese workers who have been called out by people who have lost their jobs. Why? Because the man who lost his job can find another job, but the Chinese man will never overcome the mental harm that he received. And even if we want to protect the man who lost his job, we think that it is rather worse under opposition because he's going to get attacked by millions of Chinese people online. No proper discourse will happen under opposition and no one will get solved. So the opposition gave us one main issue, right? Which is that freedom of speech will become limited. We think this is true, but it's less significant than who is harmed within the status quo. Two actors, majority and minority. So on the majority, we think there are three issues, right? Firstly, these people are not consenting to see profanity within a public sphere. I think these majority people seeing this extremely explicit content is seeing someone flashing within public. We think freedom of speech is not legitimate when these individuals are being harmed and not consenting to it. Secondly, stereotyping. As our Prime Minister told you, by seeing millions and millions of articles saying that Muslim people are terrorists will lead to these people believing that, hey, Muslims may be terrorists, which leads to my third point of radicalization. We think that when you see so many articles saying that, oh, Muslim people are terrorists, you're more likely to believe the information. And by that false information, you're likely to get triggered and escalate into terrorists because you see so much of this information. America. We think that having access to that false information leads you to escalate. Rather, we think escalation, this radicalization, is more likely to happen under opposition. Two reasons. Firstly, these search engines limit results. When you only search things like women suck, you're going to obviously, your top results are obviously going to be about why women suck. We think that that is the uniqueness of search engines. It caters it to the individual. And so if you continue searching those content, you're going to continue seeing it, and you're more likely to escalate into that situation. Secondly, advertisements. You're only going to see advertisements about neo-Nazism if you search about neo-Nazism. This is what's unique about search engines. It creates a personal space for you where you can continue to escalate into radicalization. We think this is extremely harmful, is more likely under opposition, and they're not able to give a clear mechanism as to why this is not likely to happen under their side. But before I move on, does anyone have any POIs?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Trump never called his immigrant quota a Muslim ban, and yet it was framed in that way by the political establishment of the left. So even if you use moderate language, wouldn't you still censor discussions about a Muslim ban in order to achieve your impacts on minorities?
Okay, so we think that even if we take you at your best case and say we censor everything, we're still able to protect the minorities who are being told to kill themselves, who are actually slitting their own wrists because they believe that is legitimate. So I'll expand more on that. So moving on to my second actor, a minority. Two things. No, thank you. Two things. So firstly, they're likely to get invalidated. As our PM literally told you, and opposition has not engaged this, these people are literally being told to go kill themselves, and they carry out those actions because they're being pressured by millions of people online. This is legitimately happening, and we think that that is unclear, right? You can say, oh, gay people are disgusting and they're sinners, and so that's controversial, as opposition side said. And so opposition would not be able to censor that content, and people would continue to die. Secondly, as our DPM told you, families who are unsure what to do with their gay son are likely to Google things like, what should I do with my gay son? And they're likely to reject their son because of content that exists online. No responses from opposition as to why we're able to solve all these 5 issues. And at the point that they conceded that they should restrict certain sexist and racist ideas, we think that they agree with all the issues. We think that they agree that all the issues within the status quo should be solved, but they have not given us a clear model as to why they can properly do that. So moving on to my second point about discourse. So this was opposition's best case, right? That people can learn and talk on the internet by having different information existing. This is problematic because of 2 reasons. Firstly, because of the bad language that exists online. Note here that discourse is not happening under opposition side. Why? Because it's consistent of people swearing at each other and sending personal attacks to each other. How will that lead to a proper policy of why we should protect LGBTQ+ rights? Which connects to my second reputation of how this discourse is very exclusive. Because these platforms are extremely explicit, very few minorities are going to be in that sphere. Because when you're told every single day that you should burn in hell because you're gay, you're obviously not going to be part of that discussion. What does this mean? This means that minorities are excluded from these conversations, and so this discourse that happens is extremely shallow and biased. Now, why do we as proposition solve their best case better under our side? 2 things. Firstly, accountability. Because the line is unclear under our side, rather we think that this will lead to people being more accountable because they're unsure, because they're afraid of getting called out or kicked off from online. They're less likely to say radical things. This means that the very minorities that we want to protect will not get attacked under our side. Secondly, supportive articles. So what would happen if we get rid of all this offensive content online? If we get rid of this offensive content, everything would become rather positive. Instead of they should kill themselves, it should be how to come out, or how should I support my gay son? This is unique to our side because we're able to single out all the bad content and focus on things that rather support the very people that we want to. And so by having these 2 things, we're able to effectively have better discourse with the very people who need the aid and create policy that is able to cater to these minorities. Now, the issue in the status quo is that the majority, that the vulnerable people are suffering. And we think that we should prioritize these people over the freedom of explicit speech that the opposition side wants to protect in this debate. We think that it is extremely important to protect those who are currently killing themselves, who are currently being told to kill themselves, rather than to talk about your political differences, rather than to talk about such nitpicky things, because you're able to do that on our side, but rather in a more rational way and have better discourse. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 1 second. And I noticed that from the first speaker from China, if you want to raise point of information, I think you're not quite audible.
Oh, sorry. I'll fix that. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for your speech. May we now have the third speaker from the opposition. to begin the debate. May start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi. Am I audible and visible to everybody? Yeah. I don't think the audio is wrong. Yep. Yes. Why'd you name it? Team Proposition was a team that didn't know how to have a consistent stance. Because if you listen to all of their three speakers, none of them actually defined to you what offensive actually meant and who was the one who got to define that. In first speaker, it would span all things that would be offensive, even criticizing any kinds of politicians. By their last speaker, it became, if I say a swear word, I'm automatically canceled. If they're not able to give you a consistent stance on what being offensive actually means, they cannot win this debate because we tell you that's how it's silenced. Opposition. That's how it silences every single individual who speaks out, because inevitably you're always going to offend someone. I'm going to talk about three main things in my speech. One, what is the responsibility of social engines? Two, I'm going to talk about protecting victims. And three, let's talk about who better reduces or convinces bigots to change their minds. But before I get that, just going to engage with the things that came out of Proposition WIP very quickly in terms of setup. In their previous speech, they gave you a couple of new mechanisms out of WIP about how they're going to do this. The first thing they said was this was narrowed down to swear words, but just to clarify, even if you say, I don't like Trump instead of F Trump, Trump could very well say that's still offensive and take you down. So the swear word thing is completely out of this debate. Two, they can't take this to court because the courts in the status quo are already so massively congested that taking every single small case about every single quibble that exists between CNN and The Economist and like C-SPAN, for example, is not going to be a viable alternative to take everything to court. So this new mechanism from WIP doesn't work. The third thing they told you was, look, if it came down to put choose off between the Chinese worker versus the Rust Belt worker who wants to have a job, they said they will always prioritize the Chinese person. To clarify here, they don't have the right to make that kind of decision because every single group of individuals is nuanced. Maybe as a Rust Belt worker, I actually do not have any kinds of other alternatives. Maybe I am the most vulnerable, unemployed individual who's going to be sinking into poverty. You have no right as Larry Page, the CEO of Google, to come in and determine what priorities I should have in my life. If I want to speak out and say that particular individual is hurting me, I have the ability to do that without Larry Page saying, I think that you're just less important than the other person on the other side of the world. It comes down to nuanced discussions. That is why we allow free speech in the very first place. Fourthly, when they told you the idea of how individuals are going to be forced to commit suicide, that is already outlawed on our side of the house. We told you that the reason why we're outlawing hate speech was uniquely because that is violence. No, and that is why uniquely on our side we do not allow for things like you should go kill yourself or things like that. We told you about things like are still part of inciting violence, are still part of hate speech. See, for example, we don't allow any kinds of terrorist propaganda and things like that. So we don't agree with what they're trying to
What of information?
First question, let's talk about the responsibility of social engineering. Why the status quo, it is not fair for them to be able to determine these kinds of things. When we told you that Larry Page, the CEO of Google, should not be the ones defining these particular things, they had the response of, no, but checks and balances exist, and therefore we'd be forcing Facebook to change. Well, the first thing is, you can't necessarily say that automatically gives me the mandate to rule. The only entity in this entire world that has the authority to rule, that has some kind of mandate to say what kinds of things are allowed or not, is not the CEO of a particular company just because it happened to be there, but rather on our side, the government is able to determine this. But also, even if they were to shift their stance and say that they would allow no badgering, they would allow, for example, the government or any kinds of other actors to determine what exactly constitutes offensive speech. All of that allows for abuse. That you're not able to determine as one singular person or even as a bipartisan entity what is considered offensive, because every kind of thing that cuts both ways, that is some kind of discussion or discourse is offensive to one single
information.
no possible way they could have determined this. But moreover, we also told you on our side, right, there was a unique ability of search engines to be the side that gives you all the information that you could possibly want. We already have things like echo chambers that allow for people to only look at people who agree with them. See, for example, Facebook pages, Twitter groups, people tend to already follow people who know each other and agree with each other. The unique distinction between that and social and search engines was the ability to allow for you to access every single kind of information, even the kind that refutes you or the kind that agrees with you. That was the unique ability of social engines. If that was the case, if it was the case that social engines limit the kinds of speech, I would never be able to get anywhere to the information. Before we go on to the second clash, I'm going to take your point of information.
How does a rural worker verbally assaulting the Chinese immigrant change anything at all?
Okay, I'm going to actually engage that later, but since you asked that, I'll move on to like a different clash and I'll come back to both of them. Let's talk about biggies and let's talk about the quality of discourse. Basically, your previous speech, you said that this kind of discourse was just random shouting. If they were more educated, they would just be able to fix their things. First of all, this wasn't a problem of education. It was a problem of necessity. That me changing my language doesn't change the fact that, for example, it is necessarily immigrants, it is necessarily a lack of protectionism that cost me my job, that I'm no longer having roof over my head, that I can't put food on the table. It is the facts like these that make me somewhat more vulnerable than the other persons I'm supposedly offending. And it isn't true that just after I change my language that it automatically fixes the problem. You shouting and you screaming and you protesting on the streets is still crucial for all kinds of discourse, even if it's not a full-fledged academic article, because it conveys my emotions, it conveys the necessity of you changing something in the status quo. Just screaming little facts, I think, is still very helpful on our side of the house, because it still tells individuals how desperate and how vulnerable you are. You can't come in and discredit everything that individuals say just because it's not some kind of high-level ivory tower essay. Second thing we're going to talk about, let's go back to the clash of victims. We uniquely told you the idea that on our side, that racists and bigots are still going to exist. It's about how you best protect these individuals. That if you were to silence Viktor Orban for money for president, for example, that now Viktor Orban, the person who's running Hungary in the status quo, is only able to run politically palatable statements. He doesn't change who he actually is as a person, which means that the minority who's voting for him might not actually know that his perspective is that immigrants are parasites. He might vote him for his other policies, for example, his economic policies. But once he gets into office, he actively demeans me as an immigrant. He actively keeps me out. On our side, we allow you to stay informed. We allow you to prevent someone from stepping into office by knowing who exactly as a person he is. The same thing with Trump, that when he says things like, I want to back that person by that whatever part, that isn't the worst part. The speech isn't the worst part. The worst part is when that person actually gets elected into office because I didn't know about it and he appoints people like Brett Kavanaugh and assaulted and accused rapists to become literally a judge in the Supreme Court. It's the actions themselves that actually hurt these minorities even more. We want to stop at the beginning when these individuals try to call them out for their offensive language. And the only way you're able to call them out is if you saw that offensive language in the first place, which uniquely is how we dealt with minorities. Zero engagement from that other side. But what they did tell you was that, look, gay individuals are not able to search up how to support my gay son. First of all, that was very, very uncomparative. We will still allow individuals to search up ideas like how to protect their gay son. But on their side, that might be deemed offensive to certain individuals and also be taken off. Note that that clarification was super important for them to clear up. But two, a lot of times these individuals who are searching up how to protect my gay son, it's just suddenly going to change their minds. These individuals tend to be somewhat already cemented into their ideas. So what happens when you silence another group of individuals, when you silence another bloc, is that you force them to be even more radicalized. So for example, when individuals were not allowed to express their comments on Google or CNN, they turned to Charlottesville's white supremacy protests because they felt so silenced by the majority and so unengaged with by the majority. That's when you actually increase the number of racists and bigots because they turn somewhere else to make their voices even louder when you ban all forms of other kinds of speech. So necessarily, you need to engage with them at the roots before they go too radical and they full-fledged become very, very offensive individuals who are willing to use violence to literally crack down on minorities. We think that's even more harmful on their side of the house. So at the end of the day, if they were ever going to give you any kind of solve this, we get that better on our side. Finally, I'm going to engage with this weird claim they came up with to you about this idea of equity things in debates. First of all, that wasn't comparative on either side of the house. The first thing is, note that any kinds of things that happen in debates might even seem offensive to me. The fact that debates tend to disagree with each other might be offensive to certain groups of individuals. So we think this isn't the same thing as any kinds of debate tournament. We would rather say that the same thing isn't simulated in a vast majority of political discourse that exists altogether. The other distinction is nobody is actually like president, etc., individuals in real life are actually having their lives at stake when they are expressing their own opinions. And that was the key distinction in this debate. At the end of the day, they could have won this debate. We never told you what their model was. We never told you who they're going to silence. We told you that silence is oppression.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
Thank you for your speech. May we now have the reply speaker from the opposition to close their case.
No black mother tells her daughter there is no racism in society, that you don't need to worry about anyone calling the N-word by shielding you from these facts. Because even if not from Google, from Twitter, from Spotify comments, from just walking the streets and observing people's conversations, people know that racism exists. And they know that these dangerous profanity and these languages all roam around the society. But what they would prefer, instead of hearing this word one more time, is for your daughter to have information to keep herself safe, to not fall into the hands of sexual predators, to not go into dangerous areas, to call out people, to urge more people to join the Black Lives Matter movement and march along with them, which is what they censor on their side of the house. I have 3 questions to answer in this speech. First, I want to target their only benefit, which is minorities see less triggering language and potentially feel less hurt and therefore won't harm themselves. But there are 2 things that they never even proved in this debate, which is 1, why offensiveness isn't a criteria that cuts both ways. If some Christian person thinks that searching how to support my gay son or how Christian beliefs are homophobic are all offensive language, then they can complain. And offense is still a metric that can help them take down these call-out articles of archaic views as well. Therefore, if offensiveness is a quick metric, it equally and symmetrically empowers majorities who they deem as racist as well. They never showed you why they will only help the minorities, and therefore the impact is symmetric when it comes to the benefits and the harms that it creates. But 2, they don't tell you why racists will stop saying these things just because it's taken off of Google, that it won't translate to taunting in the streets, to bullying in school, or to sexual catcalling on the streets in their cars. All these things will still happen because you never address the core evil, which is racism. You only put a band-aid over what is going on. So you never prove why they even achieve their benefit of minorities feeling less hurt. But secondly, we told you why that's not even what minorities want to begin with, because they know that racial tendencies exist. They know that people will say hurtful things to them. But what will hurt them even more is for the daughter to not know and go into a company and hurt herself, or them to have not enough evidence to file an actual complaint because this information is just taken away from them from search engines that are accessible. So we tell you, you hurt minorities on their side in a few ways in an even harsher scale. 1, because you further the radicalization that will occur. Because silencing people leads to anger, which leads to extremism. Like the alt-right leader that went from just posting his private blog post, which African Americans can just not go in and look, to armed marches into Black neighborhoods, threatening to kill children. Those are violations of physical safety. 2, they rob them of the information they need for self-protection. That Black young women should be able to know that politicians make offensive statements for them to not vote in their favor. To clash-turn jurors based on their history of blackface, to know that they disregard racial types of discrimination to protect themselves. But lastly, there was no response to what opposition said about galvanizing people for movements. That if I'm considering joining the Black Lives Matter movement and to push for equal rights amendments, I need to know that there's an urgent issue. So revealing the ugliest side of racism and sexism, exactly through the profanity, exactly through all the permeating dark thoughts in people's minds, will give me that urgency and empathy to march on the streets with them. So on their side, they may heard the N-word one last time, which is already something that's permeating through society. They don't solve their home, and the marginal benefit is small. But they rob people of the chance to really protect themselves from physical harm and from people's safety when they can't prevent sexual predators from going near my son, when there's no one marching with me and honoring George Floyd, when there's more people that vote for Trump because they don't have this information. But lastly, their inconsistent characterization harms their own case as well, because they went from swear words to profanity to attacking beliefs, all of these things offensive. The exact subjectivity of the word offensive illustrated through the proposition bench is exactly why it will be abused from politicians that will frame something as a personal attack even though it's just a political discussion. For the majority that will squash movements and labor unions because it seems offensive on certain level. It is important because the powerful individuals are exactly the people who abuse, are exactly the people who are going to empower themselves because they have more sway in society to choose what to censor, and the minorities have less to say what is actually offensive. They put a feel the ugliness, they don't reveal the urgency to tackle these issues because they shield it from the public eye. And that's a society that will never wake up and say, it is time to care about George Floyd, that Black Lives Matter, and that's a society that lives in a fake utopia, but never true justice or proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 17 seconds.
Okay, thank you. May we now have the reply speaker from the proposed petition to close their case and close the debate for call.
Am I audible? In short, the side opposition throughout the three speakers in this debate have been very dismissive of our arguments. Most of their material was contingent on the case of the Rust Belt workers in the political discourse dissing Chinese workers. Here's the thing, that is a minority case. Why? Because it's usually the case that the people in Alabama saying racist slurs for fun in order to discriminate against people and for their own selfish interests. The reason is fairly simple. It's because that in order for you to voice out a discriminatory opinion and post something that is really bad on social media is not costly at all in the anonymity, but also at the same time, you just have to click the button in order to do it. They needed to defend the majority context in this debate, which they could not. They just nitpicked the right example for their side of the house. But we told you the structural reason as to why this moral obligation, how it helps the minority, versus how it betters discourse. But here, I'm going to take on the best case scenario and based on their context, I'm going to summarize this. First on principle, second impact to minority. First on principle. They say that offensive is subjective. But here is the thing. But we are going to err on the side of caution and err on the side of minority, as they are going to err on the side of free speech. The second thing that they talk about is that this is a legitimate claim that individuals make. Here's the thing. They have never explained any reason as to why offending Chinese workers should be legitimate, just pointing out that the Chinese worker that the United States should never, should no longer accept Chinese worker is not sufficient. Then they say they talk about the political discourse, how those search engines should never take any political stance. Here's a quick response to this. You don't have to use expressive and offensive language in order to show political ideology. So it's not that those search engines are taking political stance, but rather the political expression can be possible on our side of the house. We have told you a very sophisticated mechanism as to why this is a moral obligation on the side of search engines. We told you about the capacity. We told you about the moral responsibility. We told you about how corporations get profits out of this platform, therefore has the moral obligation to control it. And we told you the devastating impact that this policy, the offensive languages and offensive contents inflict upon minority communities. Just the fact that they are being denied their identity, which they cannot change, is very crucial to know. And we got no response from the side opposition. Let's move on to the impact of minority. But I want to, before moving on, note that the principal argument is sufficient for us to affirm this motion, given that it's not necessarily contingent on the practical consequences as the first opposition points out. So impact of minority. They say two things. Firstly is the radicalization. But the first thing is that radical people would always be radical. But secondly, centrist people will no longer be exposed to those sort of racist ideology. Therefore, the number of people who opt into this radical group is going to be significantly lower. Second thing that they talk about is how social movements can be galvanized power. Here's the thing. Minority is currently politically alienated because of the use of discriminatory and offensive languages. We would accept minority on the political discourse on our side of the house. That's far much better on our side. Now, we told you a number of reasons as to why the minority is going to be saved. Because of the simple fact that the society's stereotype is going to be lessened, but also that the minority themselves will not be believed when they go to Google and without consent they see an extremely offensive content and their identity is being stripped away. The only response was that the big over would be exclusionary, racist would be racist anyway. But that is very deeply uncomparative, but also there is disregarded our argument about how we actually change the culture. I want to finally note the best case scenario for our side of the house. Zeno. Mother of a child whose son has just come out of the closet sees the website that says that LGBTQ is a sinful. that point, the actual what online content says actually transcends into the real harm that occurs to minority in a disproportionate way. For that reason, we protect minority. Very proud to progress.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 23 seconds.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for a most enjoyable debate. Can we ask everyone to wait patiently in this room as the judges deliberate? Judges will return to this room at the end of the deliberation of who delivered the results. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to judges for judging, to Team Japan for this great debate, and thank you to our chairperson for the round as well. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.